You lock your doors at night. You double-check the windows. But what if the danger is closer than you think? Like right there in your own home?
Yeah.
It's a thought that's probably crossed your mind, especially if you were raising kids back in the 80s. Today, we're diving deep into a case that shook a small town to its core. The unsolved murder of Darlene Hulse in Argus, Indiana, back in 1984.
This case is one of those that really sticks with you because it reminds us that even in the places we feel safest, evil can still find a way in. Argus back then was the kind of town where people didn't even think twice about leaving their doors unlocked. It was a true community. Everyone knew each other, and there was this sense of peace. But then Darlene's murder happened, and it shattered that sense of security for everyone.
Absolutely. And to make matters worse, Darlene's two young daughters, Marie and Melissa, they were actually home at the time and witnessed parts of the attack. Can you imagine the trauma?
It's unimaginable. The girls were just 8 and 6 years old. They were getting ready for a doctor's appointment. They were actually in the bathtub when a stranger knocked on the door. Oh my gosh. Just a normal day, and then this.
And that's the thing. It could happen to anyone. That's what makes this case so chilling.
Right. So the girls are in the tub. They hear their mom talking to the man at the door. Then there's a struggle. And then silence.
The girls later told the police that they remember hearing the attacker making these growling sounds, which just adds another layer of horror to this whole thing.
Well, it's almost animalistic.
Exactly. It suggests a level of aggression,
Right.
maybe even rage. Just bone-chilling.
Absolutely. So terrified. The girls ran to their grandparents' house nearby, and thankfully they were safe. But Darlene was gone.
The police responded immediately, of course, and a frantic search began. The entire community was in shock, a small town suddenly gripped by fear. It wasn't long before they discovered Darlene's body. It was in a wooded area, not far from the house.
Oh, gosh.
The scene was gruesome. She'd been brutally beaten.
It's heartbreaking.
Oh,
And it
yeah.
just immediately raises the question, who could have done this? Right. The police had their work cut out for them. They had to piece together the events of that day, chase down every lead, and try to make sense of this senseless act.
Absolutely. So where did they start? Do they have any suspects early on?
One of the first leads they pursued was a man named Danny Bender. Bender was a recently released convict with a history of kidnapping, and he had been overheard talking about robbing a wealthy family, a family who supposedly kept a lot of cash at home.
Okay. So right away we have a suspect with a criminal past and potentially a motive. Did they have enough to bring him in?
Well, they investigated him thoroughly. They even gave him a polygraph test, which back then, this was in 1984, remember? Polygraphs were considered a much more reliable tool than they are today.
Right, of course. DNA testing was still in its infancy back then.
Exactly. So they relied heavily on things like polygraphs. But in Bender's case, he actually had a solid alibi. It was confirmed by multiple witnesses, placing him far away from Argus at the time of the murder.
So a dead end.
Yeah. A frustrating one, for sure.
It must have been a blow to the investigation. Where did they turn next?
Another tip led them to a man named Robert Zabrowski. Zabrowski matched the general description given by Darlene's daughters, and he had left town shortly after the murder.
Leaving town right after a murder. That's suspicious.
Very suspicious. And like Bender, Zabrowski was given a polygraph test, which he failed.
Okay, so that's two potential suspects who failed polygraphs.
Right. But failing a polygraph wasn't enough to arrest someone.
Of course.
They needed more than that. And what's interesting about Zabrowski is that he seemed completely unconcerned during questioning, almost too calm, which really struck the investigators as odd.
Yeah, I can see why. You would think that even an innocent person would be a little rattled being questioned about a murder.
Right.
His nonchalant attitude definitely seems incriminating.
It did to the police, too. But despite their suspicions, they couldn't find any physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene.
So another dead end.
I'm afraid so. Without any physical evidence, they just couldn't hold him.
Two promising leads. Both dead ends. The frustration must have been building for everyone involved.
Definitely. And just when things seemed to be at a standstill, a shocking development in Texas gave the investigators a glimmer of hope.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting.
A career criminal named Ricky Mock was killed during a botched robbery, and among his belongings, they found bloodstained clothing
Oh, wow.
and a news clipping about Darlene Hulse's murder.
No way. So the case in Indiana is suddenly connected to a criminal in Texas.
It was a huge break. Could this be the missing link they'd been searching for?
What did the evidence show?
Well,
Wow.
it was a tantalizing possibility, but DNA testing, which was a relatively new technique at the time, revealed that the blood on Mock's clothing wasn't Darlene's.
Oh, man.
And to make matters worse, alibi witnesses placed Mock in Texas at the time of Darlene's murder.
So not him either.
Nope. Another dead end.
3 promising leads. 3 dead ends. This is like a roller coaster.
You can say that again. The ups and downs must have been agonizing for everyone, especially for Darlene's family.
Absolutely. So where did the investigation go from there?
Well, with the initial suspects ruled out, the investigators started looking into other angles. Maybe there was a connection they were missing, a pattern of criminal activity that could lead them to Darlene's killer.
Okay, so they're shifting their focus now from individual suspects to a possible broader pattern.
Exactly.
What kind of things were they looking into?
One thing that caught their attention was a series of harassing phone calls that had been reported by women in Argus. The calls were often filled with heavy breathing or obscene language.
That's creepy.
Very creepy. And this was long before caller ID or any way to easily trace calls.
Right, so it must have been terrifying for those women,
Yeah.
not knowing who was on the other end of the line.
Absolutely. Every phone call could be the killer.
Exactly.
Did the police ever connect those calls to Darlene's murder?
Unfortunately, no. The calls remained a chilling side note in the case, a source of unease, but ultimately a dead end in terms of solid leads.
But there was something else. Another incident that happened just across the road from where Darlene's body was found. An attempted sexual assault.
Wait. Across the street from the murder scene?
Yeah.
That's way too close to be a coincidence.
That's what the police thought too.
It seems like there's a real possibility that the same person was involved in both.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about that attempted assault.
Well, it happened about a year and a half before Darlene's murder. A woman, let's call her Pam, was at home alone when she received a phone call asking if her husband was there. She told the caller he was at work, and shortly after, a man burst into the house and attacked her in her bedroom.
Oh my gosh. That's terrifying.
Thankfully, Pam fought back fiercely and the attacker fled.
Wow. So the phone call, the home invasion, the violence, it all sounds very similar to what happened to Darlene. The similarities are striking.
Did the police believe it could be the same attacker? They absolutely considered that possibility. The modus operandi, the close proximity of the locations, the fact that both victims were women alone at home, it all pointed in that direction. They compared all the evidence they had, including blood samples, but unfortunately they couldn't conclusively link the two cases.
So close.
Yeah, forensic science wasn't as advanced back then.
Right.
It was frustrating. They had these potential links, these red flags, but not the technology or the evidence to definitively connect the dots.
So what happened next?
Well, even though they couldn't conclusively link the two cases, those similarities continued to loom over the investigation. It all added to the sense of urgency, the fear that a dangerous predator was still out there and might strike again.
The pressure must have been immense on the police to find Darlene's killer.
Oh, absolutely. The community was on edge, wondering if they were dealing with a serial offender.
So what did the police do?
The lead investigator, Sergeant Yokolet, decided to reach out to the FBI for assistance.
Okay, that makes sense. The FBI would have resources and expertise that the local police might not.
Exactly. Sergeant Yokolet meticulously documented every detail of the case, the similarities with the phone calls and the attempted assault, and emphasized his concern that they might be dealing with a serial offender.
So they're bringing in the big guns now.
They had to. This case was becoming more complex, and they needed all the help they could get.
What did the FBI think? Did they have any new insights?
Well, the FBI reviewed all the case files, and they agreed that there was a potential for a connection between the crimes.
Okay.
But they also cautioned against focusing solely on that possibility.
Right.
They suggested broadening the scope of the investigation and looking into anyone who might have had a personal grudge against Darlene or her family.
That's a good point.
They were thinking maybe it wasn't a random predator, but someone who knew Darlene, someone with a motive.
Did they have any specific individuals in mind?
They pointed the investigators towards a man named Thomas. Thomas had worked with Darlene's husband, Ron, at the local door factory. And apparently, he had made some inappropriate advances towards Darlene, which led to a heated confrontation with Ron.
Oh, wow.
And eventually, Thomas was fired.
Okay, so we have a potential motive here.
Right.
Anger,
Mm-hmm.
resentment, maybe even an unhealthy obsession with Darlene.
That's definitely possible.
Was Thomas considered a serious suspect?
He was definitely on the radar. The police interviewed him extensively, dug into his background. his whereabouts at the time of the murder, his relationships with both Darlene and Ron.
Looking for any inconsistencies,
Okay.
anything that might connect him to the crime.
Yeah.
So did they find anything?
Well, that's a question we'll have to explore further after a short break.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more on the Darlene Hulse case.
Thomas was definitely a person of interest, especially given his history with Darlene and Ron.
Right. It sounds like he had the motive and maybe even the opportunity.
But the police needed more than just suspicion. They needed evidence.
Of course.
So they dug into his alibi for the day of the murder. They talked to his friends, family members, anyone who could corroborate his story well. His alibi checked out. Witnesses placed him at a fishing trip miles away from Argus at the time of Darlene's murder.
Wow. So even with a potential motive, Thomas was cleared.
It seems so.
It's like every time they get close to a suspect, something comes up to rule them out.
It's a frustrating pattern, but it happens a lot in these kinds of cases.
So where did the investigation go from there?
With Thomas ruled out, the investigators had to take a step back and reevaluate the case.
They were back to square one.
Pretty much. They had chased down every lead, explored every angle they could think of, and still no closer to finding Darlene's killer.
What about Darlene's husband, Ron? Was he ever a suspect?
Of course. The police have to consider every possibility, especially in a case like this.
Right.
So they questioned Ron extensively. They looked into his whereabouts at the time of the murder. They even administered a polygraph test.
And what did they find?
Wow. Ron's alibi checked out, too. He was at work when the attack happened, and his daughters confirmed that they saw the attacker and that it was a stranger to them.
So Ron was cleared as a suspect?
Yes. He cooperated fully with the investigation, and there was just no evidence to suggest he was involved.
Okay.
But even though Ron was cleared, it didn't bring them any closer to finding the real killer.
This case is a real puzzle.
It is, and unfortunately, it's one that remains unsolved to this day.
So Darlene's murder is still a mystery.
I'm afraid so.
What a tragedy for her family and for the entire community.
It's a reminder that even in the places we think are safest, evil can still lurk.
That's for sure.
And sometimes, justice is elusive.
It's a tough truth to swallow.
It is. But it's important to remember that even cold cases can heat up with new information or advancements in technology.
There's always hope.
Always.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating and heartbreaking deep dive.
It really has.
If anyone out there has any information about the Darlene Hulse case, no matter how small it may seem,
Yeah.
please contact the authorities.
You never know. Your tip could be the one that finally cracks this case wide open.
That's right. And if you're interested in more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations into the world of unsolved mysteries.
We'll be back with more chilling cases. And maybe even some answers.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
So last we heard, the police were looking into Thomas, this guy who worked with Darlene's husband, Ron, and had made some unwanted advances toward Darlene. Did they find anything to connect him to the murder?
Unfortunately, no. He had an alibi. And there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime scene.
So another dead end.
It seems so.
They were so close with him. He seemed to have a motive.
He did. But without solid evidence, they couldn't pursue him further.
Did they ever reconsider those earlier suspects? Like Bender or Zabrowski, even Mock?
They did go back and review those files, especially after the FBI suggested focusing on personal grudges.
Right.
But nothing new came up.
So they hit another wall.
Yeah. It's like every time they got close, the trail went cold.
What about Ron, Darlene's husband? Was he ever a suspect?
Of course. In a case like this, the police have to consider all possibilities, especially the spouse.
Right. So what happened with Ron?
They questioned him extensively, gave him polygraph, looked into his alibi. His alibi checked out. He was at work when the attack happened, and his daughter's statements supported that. They told the police they saw the attacker and that it wasn't their father.
So Ron was cleared.
Yes,
This is such a sad story.
it really is.
A young mother murdered, two daughters who witnessed the attack, and after all this time, still no answers.
It's heartbreaking. And unfortunately, not uncommon. There are so many cases like this where the trail goes cold and justice remains elusive.
It makes you realize that even in seemingly safe places, like a small town, tragedy can strike. And sometimes we never get the answers we're looking for.
That's a tough truth.
It is.
But it's important to remember that even cold cases can heat up with new information or advancements in technology.
There's always hope. Well, this has been a truly fascinating
Yeah,
and heartbreaking deep dive.
it really has.
If anyone out there has any information about the Darlene Hulse case,
Mm.
no matter how small or insignificant it may seem, please contact the authorities.
Even the smallest detail could be the key to solving this case.
That's right. And if you're intrigued by unsolved mysteries like this one, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations into the dark and often baffling world of crime. Until next time, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.